leg of our year's journey together through the history of Western philosophy. Namely, 4 weeks dealing with about 200 years of empiricism, 19th and 20th century empiricism. And just to get the perspective, let's come back to this diagram, which you're familiar with, the intersection of modern empiricism and rationalism of the Enlightenment in the kind of synthesis effected by Immanuel Kant, out of which grew a distinction between two methodologies that have persisted in philosophy to this day. The rationalism of the Enlightenment was mainly on the European continent, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and the outgrowth of that, as we've seen in Hegel, the existential tradition, to some extent people like Whitehead, but the outcome a phenomenological kind of method that tries to look at reality through the lens of the human self-awareness. Now, that phenomenological method continues today, as we were seeing last week, to dominate European thought, Western European thought on the continent. On the other hand, the empiricist tradition, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, is mainly in Britain, and continued in the 19th century with the three people we're going to be looking at, Auguste Comte, John Stuart Mill, and Ernst Mach. And the greatest of these is Ernst Mach. No, take it back, the greatest of these is John Stuart Mill. Sorry, the last of them, Ernst Mach, but John Stuart Mill is the one to emphasize. But that continuing empiricist approach led to an emphasis on scientific method being universalized for all kinds of human knowledge. Now, whereas then the way of seeing the world, the lens through which everything was seen for the European tradition, is the human spirit with its creative freedom. And I think that's a fair generalization, whether you're talking of Hegel or of Sartre or of Dewey, you see. On the other hand, the lens through which the 19th century empiricists are seeing everything is simply the lens of nature as viewed through the scientific method. And so the ways part. Now, to this day, throughout the 20th century, it's fair to say that the dominance, the philosophical dominance in the continent of Europe is phenomenological, whereas the philosophical dominance in English-speaking philosophy is empiricist. And while perhaps not as imperialistic about scientific methodology as it was in Mill and the early 20th century, still a pretty strong theme that something like scientific criteria should be used in judging all human knowledge. So that's the distinction. There are attempts, obviously, to see comparisons between the two, to build bridges. I may have mentioned to you before that there was in the 1940s, the late 40s, a joint conference between English and French philosophers, the proceedings of which were published in a volume called La Philosophie Analytique, Analytic Philosophy. And as you try to read it, you find that while the Frenchmen write in English, which is of help to many of us, and the English write in French, they pass like ships in the night, because they're just dealing with different things. Also, 5 years ago, I was at a conference in Toronto, where there were European philosophers, more Dutch than French, and Anglo-Americans, dealing with the concept of rationality. Same experience, passing like ships in the night, you see. Simply because the methodology is different to the kinds of expectations of it. That's not to say that there are not some analytically oriented philosophers in European thought, there are, or that there are not some phenomenological thinkers in American thought, shall we say. There are. Those large departments try to have at least one representative, you know. We have one, Roberts, except that he has sort of wandered over into analytic thought, thanks to his work in Wittgenstein as well as his work in Kierkegaard and Bultmann, you see. So the situation is there. Now, what I want to do today is to characterize 19th century empiricism, and we may have to continue with this on Monday, when we will be moving into 20th century. Next Monday, we'll be moving into early 20th century with people like Bertrand Russell, John Stuart Mill, George Ernest Moore, G.E. Moore. Okay? But for the characterization of 19th century, look at these three emphases. The extension of Enlightenment objectivity into, and I've written the hypothetico-deductive method, perhaps to make it a little more clear, into a hypothetico-deductive method. That is to say, a methodology applicable to science in the spirit of Enlightenment objectivity, rejecting the Kantian kind of Copernican revolution. Now, what do I mean by hypothetico-deductive method? That phrase, you'll find it becomes increasingly familiar. But the previous Enlightenment thought in these 18th century empiricists had, of course, premises that are empirical generalizations, and from that, deductive inferences. And if we're talking about the continental rationalists, like Descartes, Spinoza, then what you have is some sort of intuitive, self-evident, innate, a priori premises, and deductive method. In other words, the methodology of Enlightenment thought was from premises via deduction to logical conclusion, either a priori or empirical premises. Now, innate ideas and so forth are questionable. That empirical generalizations are awfully hard to verify. You can falsify them, but verifying them is empirically pretty difficult, and you've got the problem of induction. So instead of empirical generalizations or a priori premises, the emphasis is on a hypothesis as the premise. So from an empirical hypothesis, if this is true, what follows? Hypothetico-deductive. So a hypothesis for the premise, leading to deductive methods. Now, this is much more in keeping with actual scientific method. Remember, one of the criticisms of Francis Bacon and his inductive methods was that he gave no room to the use of hypotheses. Experimental methods, but without hypotheses. Well, here you see is a more mature approach, 19th century, and the hypothetical deductive method. This becomes the understanding of scientific method in John Stuart Mill, in Ernst Mach, in Bertrand Russell, in 20th century logical positivism. In fact, it really wasn't cracked until Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, when it was recognized that science works more with paradigms than with hypotheses. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now, the second characteristic, the extension of that method of the hypothetico-deductive to the human sciences. Previously, the tendency had been to think simply of science as dealing with physics, astronomy. That's where it started. Chemistry came into the game, biology gradually. But the significant thing in the 19th century is the extension of these kinds of methods to the human sciences, that is to say, to psychology, to sociology, to politics. The attempt also to apply it to ethics, so that ethics would become an empirical science. That's precisely what John Stuart Mill was after in his utilitarianism. He wanted to have an empirical scientific ethic. So the extension of that scientific method to the human knowledge, the natural sciences of the social sciences, this becomes known in some quarters as scientism. Scientism. That science and science alone yields reliable knowledge. Scientism. And of course, our continental friends, meantime, would have conniptions over this sort of thing. What about the human spirit? What about the phenomenological method, and so forth? In fact, you might think of Husserl's attempt to deal with what he called the crisis in the sciences in the light of this. He wants to make philosophy into a rigorous science, but not with a hypothetical method. It's a a priori principles derived by the phenomenological method. So then, these things, but there's a consequence. And the consequence of this extension of scientific method to global range is the development of phenomenalism, anti-realism, anti-metaphysics. Yeah, phenomenalism, all we know is phenomena, things as they appear to us. What nowadays we call anti-realism. We don't know knowledge of ultimate reality as it is in itself. And the way it comes out particularly in the 19th century is rejection of metaphysics. And I think that's particularly significant in the 19th century because the nature of metaphysics, you see, was viewed in terms of the phenomena-noumena distinction. Viewed, if you like, in the light of the representational theory of knowledge, which left you with a lot of unanswered questions about the reality that it's supposed to represent. It's noticeable that people like Bradley, their works on metaphysics bear the titles like Appearance and Reality. That was Bradley's title, Appearance and Reality. Now, essentially, what the positivist movement is doing is saying all we know are the appearances, ruling out the reality. Notice that as you read John Stuart Mill. If you're interested in the question about mind and body, what is mind? Says Mill, mind is just the permanent possibility of reflections, ideas of reflection. Now, mind isn't a thing. We don't know anything about its reality. What we mean by the word mind is, well, that which presumably is involved with further experience in the future, the permanent possibility of reflections. Well, what's matter? Permanent possibility of sensations. He says, that's not what matter is, it's what matter does. Well, phenomena, that's what it is for us. So a thoroughgoing phenomenalist view develops in Comte, Mill, Mach, Bertrand Russell. Yes and no, depending which decade of Bertrand Russell's career you're reading. He reserved the human person's right to change his mind and did it quite successfully at times. So that's the characterization. Now, how does this come out in these individuals? Well, first of all, Auguste Comte, Frenchman. Died in 1857. You have a chapter about Comte in Stumpf, and you have some selections in Gardner's anthology. You'll find Comte easy to get a hold of, easy to read. Watch for two things. One is his law of three stages. The other is his contention about the unity of science. Now, the law of three stages is his formulation of an empirical generalization about the history of science. He's an empiricist, and he's interested in the history of science. So he's going to give you an empirical generalization about the history of science. Namely, that science evolves through three stages. From a religious stage, to a speculative stage, to a scientific stage. Now, the religious stage, of course, produces theology, mythology, and so forth. Fictions. Imaginative fictions, like the Divine Right of Kings, over which Charles I lost his head, you remember. Or fetishes in primitive animism. Notions of divine providence. This is the imaginative childhood of the human mind. The second stage is the speculative, dealing with abstract ideas, constructs, metaphysical constructs, like theories of universals and essences, natural law ethics and jurisprudence, theories of natural rights, democratic ideals like all men are born equal, which are hardly empirical generalizations, notions of teleology, alchemy, astrology, final causes. You see, all these involve speculative theories about hidden realities. This is the adolescence of the human mind. But the third stage is empirical, scientific, dealing with what is positively known, what we can positively assert, hence the term positivism. What can be positively asserted, certain. This is the maturity, the adulthood of the human mind. And it's here in the scientific stage, then, that what we try to do is to formulate general covering laws. A general covering law is an empirical generalization that covers all the data. General covering laws. And it's on the basis of those general laws, generalizations, that you can make your predictions. And therefore develop technology to make use of natural processes. So the positive stage, then, is that to which the sciences are evolving. Now, he tries to trace the various sciences in this way. Religion has evolved to the metaphysical stage. A lot of theology is simply metaphysics. Chemistry has evolved, of course, from primitive fetishism through alchemy to science, empirical science. But what he is particularly anxious to see develop is a science of social change. A science of social change. After all, he's living in the first half of the 19th century in France, and if you're familiar with French history, it was an age of upheavals. So we want a science, an empirical science, of social change. And this is the beginning of what now has become sociology. Social majors, if you look into the history of your science, you'll find this is the way it began. There was another man, roughly contemporary, a little bit older with Auguste Comte, a man named Saint-Simon. But sociology began in an attempt to be thoroughly empirical. And it's only in very recent years, matters of a decade or two, that sociology has begun to incorporate some of the phenomenological tradition and to recognize subjectivity and so forth, the influence of people like Max Weber. Now, the unity of science is the second emphasis in Auguste Comte. Very simple. It's the notion that all of the sciences follow essentially the same method. All sciences follow essentially the same method. There's no differentiation between the study of nature and the study of human beings. The same method prevails for both, or two. And that thesis of the unity of the sciences is one of the things in Comte which has persisted into the 20th century, emphasis on the unity of the sciences. That's what Dewey is working with, where he tries to take the developed scientific method in reconstruction in philosophy and say this needs to be applied to social change, to handling social problems, to politics, to education, so on and so forth, unity of the sciences. The differences between the sciences are differences of complexity. In that, sociology, for instance, has to build on psychology. Psychology has to build on biology. Biology has to build on chemistry. Chemistry has to build on physics. Physics has to build on mathematics. So there is a hierarchical arrangement of the sciences in terms of their complexity. And it's interesting that historically they have developed in that sequence, more and more complex. Well, that's my summary of Auguste Comte. Notice, if you have the Gardner Anthology, did you bring it? I should have warned you. Notice on page 151 his comments about Descartes. Yeah, every French philosopher has to pay dues to the Descartes Union. And here's Comte's dues. While Descartes was rendering to the world the glorious service of instituting a complete system of positive philosophy, yes, what you know for certain, the reformer with all his bold energy was unable to raise himself so far above his age as to give it complete logical extension by comprehending in it the part of physiology that relates to intellectual and moral phenomena. The part of physiology that relates to intellectual and moral phenomena. After having instituted a vast mechanical hypothesis upon the fundamental theory of the most simple and universal phenomena, he extended the same philosophical spirit to the different elementary notions, relations of the animal organism, but when he arrived at affections and the intellect, he stopped abruptly and constituted from them a special study, as an appurtenance of metaphysico-theological philosophy. A word like that has to be something bad. To which he thus endeavoured to give a new kind of life after having wrought far more successfully in sapping its scientific foundations. And on the next page,